Mandy Miller. Welcome back to the Rocky Mountain Writer Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, last time you were on was 2021, and you had a brand new, I think it was your debut novel at that point,
Yep.
States of Grace, just out.
Right.
And here we are, and it's been a few months since your sequel has come out, but we wanted to talk with you about that and some of all the other things you've got going on in your writing life, which is you're busy.
Yep, been busy, I guess. COVID was
Yeah.
good for writing. For
Not
me.
for everybody. Yeah.
I
Not for
know.
everybody.
Yeah, if I'd probably had a house full of kids, it would have been different, but
Right. Well, before we get into some of the other projects you've got going on, let's talk about the sequel, Friday Night in the Glades. Came out when?
it came out about a year ago. It's been out for a little while. Yeah.
Okay.
July 1 last year, I believe. July or August last year.
Okay. And it's the same main character as in States of Grace.
Correct. Same protagonist.
Yeah.
Very different structure, but same protagonist.
Well, tell us about the main character and tell us about how you approached the structure this time.
So the first book, I guess, was a learning process because the protagonist is Grace Locke. She is a sort of fallen. In the first book, she is trying to get her life back together after having had a whole bunch of personal disasters. She's a lawyer. She was a former prosecutor turned defense lawyer because she hit some hard times. And the first book is about a case with a young teenage girl who's accused of killing her guidance counselor. The book is written, as a matter of structure, the book is written first person, present tense now. But when I did the first draft of the book, long before I even tried to get it published, it was third person past. So I rewrote the book, different point of view, different tense. And there's only one point of view character in that first book. So that was kind of a learning experience to go from, I thought it should be third person. And then when it was done, I realized, no, there's just so much about the character that would be better told in the first person. So the second book has Grace, first person present, but there's a second point of view character in the book, a young kid, a high school football player, and his point of view is told in third person past. And we start one point of view in the present going forward, and then the other point of view character in the past going up to the present, so that the idea is that they would meet. And that way I was able to, if you read the book, and I'm not going to give away the spoiler because it's right in the first chapter, if you read the book, it allows the author to provide certain information at certain points in time to keep the suspense alive. But other than that, the first one was a pretty traditional legal mystery. The second one's more suspense than it is an actual whodunit kind of mystery. So they're in that genre, suspense, mystery, thriller. People have all different ways of describing them.
Yeah.
And the second one is less courtroom oriented than the first one. So while she's a lawyer and that's part of it, and there's certain legal things in the second one, it's more a story about how she helps this young kid.
Gotcha. Interesting. So if you had to go back for the first one, what would you have done differently? What did you learn about that? You wish you'd put it in a different point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot you can tell in third person deep, but I think the voice, depending on what your character is and what you want them to sound like, I think the voice is better delivered in the first person for purposes of that character anyways. Between the dialogue and the sort of internalization, reflection, commentary, it's much more sincere to put on the page a person's view that may not necessarily be desirable or likable, but it is their view, as opposed to a reader being told at a distance a certain amount of information. So I think it's easier almost to take the journey with the character when it's a first person in that case. And her character requires that she's a little mouthy, she's a little edgy. And I think when you can imagine yourself in her shoes, it's easier to take some of those warts and not dislike her per se. The other thing, so the tense also matters. So it was first and present that kind of went hand in hand, because then there's an immediacy to the story. When you tell third person past, there's something you've already given away. We already know the characters survived to tell the story. Yeah. First person present allows you to be very succinct almost in the dialogue, and it's much more to the point, and it just gives a sense of things happening in the now. Sometimes it's hard to write in the present tense, because it seems sometimes it can get awkward. So that's a little thing you have to deal with, making sure it flows. But in terms of a mystery or suspense, I think the immediacy of the present tense certainly helped the book a lot.
That's great. Yeah. Some people say with first person, the challenge is that your character can only know what they know, and that's got to be, you got to be faithful and honest to that. They can't really drift outside and suddenly be bringing in information that is something they wouldn't know. So it does create some challenges.
That is challenging. But in the second book, because there's another point of view character, there's things that we know about what's going on in that second point of view that she doesn't know. So that sort of creates an internal tension in the book too. The other problem with the first person point of view, and I read a lot of memoirs, is it becomes the I, me, the memoir, that when you read something and it's too belly button examining. So that's kind of an issue. You don't want to be eyeing all the time. So I think maybe that lends itself a little bit to some of the stuff I like writing better. Like I like setting, and I like mood, and I like pacing, and all those issues of writing that aren't related to dialogue or internalization. So I think if you're only writing dialogue, if it's a very sort of quick, abrupt, if you open a lot of new books these days, there's a lot of dialogue. There's a lot of white space. There's a lot of dialogue. There's very little setting. There's very little description. It's all story driven by dialogue, punctuated by minor league setting. I think that's easier to do in the third person. I think first person allows for a little more amplification of the setting. I mean, those books are about Florida. So I think that's why people read some books. I certainly read certain books because they're set in a certain place.
Sure.
And if I want to read about, the degradation of the beach and the environment and the sort of strange characters that parade up and down the beach, and I want to sort of see it in my head, there's a good opportunity for that when you're writing in first person, and it can take you away from the I dialogue all the time. Right.
Very interesting. So you live in Steamboat Springs, but your books are set in Florida. How do you do you make a push to market them in Florida? How does that work?
Yeah, well, I used to live in Florida. I lived in Florida for a long time. I think it was a lot easier to write the books once I was away from Florida, because I had a little bit more perspective. I wasn't the fish in the fishbowl then. I have obviously a lot of contacts. I'm a lawyer, so I practice law in Florida. The character is a lawyer, so there's a certain nexus there. I went to an MFA program in Florida, so I have contacts there. So yeah, and I'm a part of a group called the Tropical Authors Group, which is not only based in Florida. It's writers who write about the Caribbean and about boats and about diving, and it's more men than women in this particular group. So that might be the reason I'm on board. We have a few women, but the idea is to write these books that people will like to read about places they're not in. So, for me, that helps a lot on the marketing, being part of a bigger group who have kind of a collective interest in sun and sand and the ocean. A lot of the other writers write about the Caribbean or the Keys, or, the South Seas. A lot of them are more international thriller type books. They've got more military aspects to them than mine do. But the idea is that some will want to read about this far off place when they're, sitting in 25 feet of snow in North Dakota in the middle of the winter. So that has helped with the marketing. I also think, though, people who don't live in warm places are the people who like to read about warm places. I mean, I know I do. I like to read a lot about I love the Keys. It's probably my favorite place on the planet. So I like to read a lot of books like that during the winter. So, I think it's like a lot of mysteries and thrillers. They're particularly series. They're very place specific.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. And so you mentioned South Florida, and it certainly seems like that is one of the hot spots for crime fiction and mysteries, certainly over the years. Yeah. Do you have any favorite
Well, yeah, you
writer?
just need to open the newspaper down there and you've got some
Yeah.
weird story about, some odd, the Florida man thing is a thing. Florida, the strangest things happen in that state, and a lot of things there can kill you. So, it's kind of rife for good crime fiction.
Yeah. Do you have any favorite South Florida writers from over the
I
years?
do. Yeah, definitely. Of different genres too, in the sort of thriller, mystery, suspense arena. Probably the biggest inspiration for me was James W. Hall, who was a professor of mine in the MFA program I took classes in. And he started as a poet out of the Iowa Writers Workshop, and then over time started to write crime fiction about his character Thorne, and has written many, many books. And I'm sort of proud to say that, in a strange turn of the wheel of life, we both ended up in this tropical authors group, and he used to be my teacher. So that's was really a nice thing for me. But his books are great because he writes with, the prose is beautiful about the Keys. And the character is very compelling, the Thorne books. And then he has other series beyond that. So I love him. In terms of more literary fiction, I love John Dufresne, who has written any number of all kinds of different books. He's written crime. He's written a lot of literary fiction, which has been very well reviewed and has received many different awards. He wrote Love Warps the Mind a Little, one of my favorite books of all time. He writes short stories. My favorite book of short stories of all time is one of his. It's called The Way That Water Enters Stone. And it's just a beautiful book of quite short stories. He also writes writing books. So he writes a lot of crafty books. So he's definitely one of my other South Florida favorites. I like Les Standiford, who was also in the same program. He used to write the John Deel books. He doesn't anymore because he writes more narrative nonfiction now. Amazing books about Henry Flagler and the railroad, the history of West Palm Beach. So all that kind of stuff, I'm just sort of steeped in that. And then one cannot forget Dave Barry, who I just read The Swamp, his latest, and it's hilarious. It has all those ridiculous things about Florida that really make you laugh. Dave Barry and Carl Hiaasen both make it look easy, but what they do is incredibly difficult. And then probably my favorite poet of all time is Richard Blanco, who was in the same program as me before me, and then became Obama's inaugural poet. And my favorite book of his is called Looking for the Gulf Motel. And I taught young kids creative writing this summer, and I read them those poems, and they loved them, and they were 10 to 15. So obviously the poem, and they've never been to Florida, so obviously there's something there. That's kind of my Florida
Wow.
writer slate.
I want to state for the record that we did not practice that. Well, I just lobbed that question out, and you just gave us, I don't know, out of half a dozen or eight, so wonderful suggestions, titles and everything. I love that, Mandy. You're right on top of it. That was a great response. I think, didn't James Hall come to Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers a few years back? I'm not
He could have,
positive.
not when I was
Yeah,
there, but
yeah,
I certainly, I've seen him at other conferences, and he's a
yeah,
great speaker.
yeah,
And he's one of these people that can do and can also teach. And he's
yeah,
a really, really good teacher. He makes teaching, the fiction classes at FIU just so much fun and so useful.
yeah,
And again, he strikes that great balance between writing beautiful prose and its genre, which is such a terrible word in certain ways, but it's
yeah,
also a very compelling story, which is a real art.
yeah. I read James Hall back in the 80s. I'm going to say it was back in the 80s sometime. And it had one of the absolute creepiest opening sentences. I wish I could remember it. It was just absolutely beguiling and beautiful at the same time. And oh boy, it was really just pulled you right along from the get-go. But
You
I'll
can
have to,
tell he was a poet because the
yeah,
language is very important. And he no longer teaches. He's retired. He lives in North Carolina, and he's still writing books. So he's still out there.
yep, yep. Very good. Wow. Do you write poetry?
Oh my God. No, that would be a terrible. Well, let me put it this way. When I was taking classes in the MFA program, I had to take poetry. And I tortured, I'm sure, my instructor with my poems. But no, I don't write poetry. I read quite a lot of poetry. But I don't write poetry at all. I just find the whole thing kind of intimidating. Um, I know we don't write in iambic pentameter anymore, but I am kind of intimidated, not by the language part, not by the imagery part, but by the kind of meter and what's appropriate and what's this form and what's that form. And I really don't know.
Well, you and me makes too. I also enjoy poetry. If somebody says read this great poem, or I run across something, or I'll look at the poems in the New Yorker and see if I can get inside them. I listen to the New Yorker poetry podcast with interest.
Oh, okay.
It's really interesting to listen to them break down poems and talk about them. But my head just doesn't go there. I feel like a complete I'd be just an imitator of somebody who might be trying to write poetry. I mean, I just don't know
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, for my
interesting.
classes this summer, particularly the 10 to 12-year-olds, I read them a lot of poems, and it was camp, it wasn't school. So I'm trying to make it fun. So we did a lot of haiku, which is a fun way to introduce kids to poetry. And then I had one kid who was so good at it that he ambled around school and camp the rest of the summer trying to speak in haiku, which was hilarious to his campmates, annoying in the end. But that kind of thing is fun. But like I said, I love to read it, and when you can read them a poem that was written by like the Richard Blanco poem, for instance. And he writes this poem. He's from a Cuban family in South Florida, and he writes this poem called "Looking for the Gulf Motel." That he goes to the west coast of Florida from the east coast of Florida with his Cuban family for their vacation, and it describes how they have to, the mother, because they don't have money, bring food, and they live in this sort of low end Florida motel. And by the end, and it's the story of him and his brother. And when I finished reading the poem, on the last line, there was a collective, oh, it was
No,
just so emotional and so good for them. And I look at something like that and I'm like, oh no, I could never do that.
yeah. Tell us about the camp you teach at, because it's a pretty special place.
Yeah, this summer, it was my first time teaching there this summer, but I taught at this performing arts camp in Steamboat called Perry Mansfield. And it has two sides to it, theater and dance. It has existed for 110 years. It was founded by two women, Perry and Mansfield, Charlotte Perry and what's Ms. Mansfield's name? Anyways, there were two women who came to the Valley and they loved horseback riding, so it still has an equestrian element to it. And Portia Mansfield, how could I forget that?
Yeah.
And they rode horses and started this camp to train young people in the theater arts and in dance. One was a dancer, one was an actress. And very famous people have gone there. Dustin Hoffman went there. Julie Harris went there. Jessica Biel went there. And it's a camp. It's not a school. So it only takes place in the summer. It's meant to be fun, but it's very intense. They're programmed from the morning to night with professionals to learn their craft. And they have to audition to get in. And one of the elective classes is creative writing, but each student has to take creative writing at one point during their stay at the camp. So you get a bunch of kids 10 to 12, 13 to 15, 16 to 18. And so you got to find something to do with them 5 days a week to make writing interesting to them. And a lot of them really take to it because they like to write. And then others, it's something brand new. So it was my first summer there, and it was really fun. You have to really find fun writing things to do as exercises. So it was kind of good.
Yeah. And it's an overnight camp, right? It's not a day camp, is it?
So it's day in camp, yeah. So the little ones 2 weeks, the middle ones 4 weeks, and the older ones 6 weeks. And
Yeah.
it's very intense. And they live in these very primitive cabins. I think the real saving grace for the place is the food is really good. So they don't complain too much, but there
Yeah.
are, bears and moose and insects and mice. And so it's kind of like, it's very primitive on the outside, but it's highly sophisticated on the training side. And they all do a major performance at the end.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it's pretty fun.
Yeah. How did teaching that class help you think about your own writing?
Yeah. It's finding craft things that you can sort of winnow down to short little exercises. So it reminded me that sometimes the less said, the better. We would talk a lot about creating the mood, and it's the language you use more than the words you put on the page. And it's what's not said sometimes that creates much more of the mood or the pace. So we did a lot of stuff like that. And we did a lot of nature writing because we were in the woods. So that was kind of fun. So I try to take topics, point of view. It was amazing to me. 10 to 12-year-olds could already define for me what point of view was, even before I told them a thing. So I was pretty impressed. So we did point of view, we did setting, we did themes. What are themes? And so we kind of tried to pick a topic for every day, and then they would do an exercise either alone or collectively that would demonstrate the topic for the day. So that was kind of how I ran the class. And then we did some fiction, some nonfiction, some poetry, some music lyrics.
Wow.
So, and then I would play them audiobooks so they could hear things being said as opposed to writing them down.
Wow. I want to go back to being 12 years old and go to that camp. That's what I
Yeah.
want.
Oh, they have so much fun. It's kind of a shock when they get there because it is so primitive. And once they start to make friends, by the time they all leave, they were all crying the last day. It was really funny.
Oh, how far outside Steamboat Springs is it?
It's just outside of town. It's on the way to
Okay.
Strawberry Park Hot Springs.
Oh,
So
yeah. Sure.
it's about 1.5 miles from downtown, but it
No,
really is the wilderness. There's
Yeah.
nothing out there except the camp.
Gotcha. That's awesome. Wow. Well, one thing we talked about, you and I had a chance to visit last week in Steamboat when I was up there for an event, and I was just really admired your whole sense of community about writing and writers and just your approach. And you told, in fact, I ordered a copy of, I'll hold it up for the
You.
Friday Night in the Glades after I got back because I wanted to dive in. And one thing that we talked about and I was really impressed with was a great quote you got from Jeffrey Fleischman, who you and I are both big fans of his work. Can you just tell that story about how, you came to get a blurb from,
Yeah,
in my mind, one of the finest crime fiction writers out there?
no question. And Pulitzer Prize finalist, longtime war correspondent.
Yep.
So I had read his crime series. The third one wasn't out at that point, but the Sam Carver series. So My Detective, The Last Dance, and the last one is called Goodnight Forever. And I'm a Chandler fan, the sort of Chandler Hammett noir sort of genre. And I think Jeffrey Fleischman is almost like noir on steroids in a way, much more literary. It's noir, but it's also highly literary and very spare writing. And I had really enjoyed the books, loved the character. And I was kind of surprised that he was a foreign correspondent because the books are very, they're small, they take place in LA. It's very bound by place. Nothing about the international world in that series. And I love them so much. And when I was looking for blurbs for the book, I've always been of the opinion that if you don't ask, you don't get. And so I thought, well, I found him on Twitter. And this is the lesson: never give up on trying to, beat down somebody's door. They can only say no. So I found him on Twitter and I told him I loved his books and why, and I had written this book, and I told him my experience. And then do you think he might like to read the book and give me a blurb? And so he asked for the book, and I sent him the book, and he read the first few chapters, and he wrote me back and he said he loved it, and he finished it, and he gave me blurbs for both books. And that was just a total cold call. I was shocked, to say the least. This was somebody that I didn't know in the slightest. I just admired. And the circle comes everything will come full circle in a couple weeks. I'm going to go to BoucherCon in San Diego, and on my way there, I'm stopping to see friends and family in Los Angeles, and I'm going to have dinner with him, which is a real treat because in the meantime, I've lived a lot of my life overseas. So if I could go back and do it again, I would definitely be a foreign correspondent. That would be my dream job. So that's kind of fun too. And so I was reading his very first book yesterday, which came out in 2008. And it's called Promised Virgins. It's one of those books you read, and this was his very first book. It is not crime fiction. It's international intrigue, I'd say, but it's much more literary. It reminds me a lot of Mohsin Hamid, to read The Reluctant Fundamentalist, and the other one, Exit, not No Exit, Exit West. And so he writes international kind of literary, you're not quite sure what's going on. Well, Promised Virgins is like that. And it's so well written, and the prose is so brilliant. I really hope he writes some more of that. The Carver series is over, and so maybe he's going to get back to that, but I will certainly ask. So the basic lesson is, don't say, oh, that person won't help me. He was so generous, and it's in the middle of, the Ukrainian war and all the stuff he's reporting on, and he still took the time to read my little book and give me a very nice blurb for it. So, don't give up hope. Just ask. They can only say no or ignore you. That's happened to me too. But this one I was lucky. So.
Yep. Great story. Really good. I've read the first two of the Carver books. They are outstanding. I can't wait to read the third. And yeah, he's really, really something. That's great. So, I mean, the point is also, I mean, like you say, never hesitate to ask. You know, all you can, if you don't ask, you know what the answer is going to be, because there won't be an answer because you didn't ask.
Right.
You know what's going to happen. Also, just to ourselves, I mean, you know, whether you've been published or not, reach out and help when you get asked. Why not? Why not take a look? What do you have to lose by taking a look at something? And you know, you might find a gem and be able to really help somebody in their career. You might also read it. You might read it and say, you know, this isn't quite right for me, and it's perfectly fine at that point to write back and say, you know, this just wasn't for me, and I'm sorry, I just don't feel like I can endorse it, but I wish you well. It just, you know, anyway.
Yeah, I think the footnote on that is too that, you know, you sort of have to bear in mind that the publishing industry in the way that it is right now, and the not only the high selectivity of the process, which it is, but also the highly networked nature of the process. Like if you look at all these new books that come out, you look every Tuesday, a lot of these people have ins, they have connections. They may not be a better writer than you. They may just have better exposure to you, a better platform than you, whatever it is. So there's so much good out there that is just not making it, you know, to publication, or at least to, after it's published, getting attention, that it's, you know, it's good to just try to take a look and see if you like it. And, you know, if you are a published author, then give them the nice blurb and tell other people about the book. I mean, it's no skin off your nose. And I just think so much good stuff doesn't make it to the market. The whole, I mean, Amazon is great and all that, self-publishing is great, but it just ends up in a big pile. And how do you differentiate, you know? And one of the ways to differentiate yourself is by getting somebody who's kind of a little more Tony than you to differentiate you from the crowd.
Yep. Well, and we talked about this last week. You have some other projects that are not in the crime fiction series that you are working on right now, which you're in that space right now. Right.
Yeah. It's almost done, the third Grace book. I have a draft of a spin-off character in a kind of, it's a much more humorous sort of type of crime fiction, if crime can be funny, which it is a lot of times. Some of the craziest things that ever happened to me as a lawyer were things that happen in criminal court. So that's on one side. And then I do have a draft of a historical fiction novel that I completed, but that I want to do another pretty serious deep dive on again before I go out trying to query the book. But that's something entirely different for me, required a lot more research. Obviously, it's about a time and place where I've never been. So, but that was really good. And I really, sort of my inclination in a way is to be a little more literary. So I have another couple of ideas on the back burner to try to, I read a lot of literary fiction, and I read a lot of old classics. So I kind of want to maybe step away from the crime world for a little bit and just try something different.
Yep. Very good. Well, Mandy, this has been a great rundown on a busy writing life. You definitely have a lot of things going on, for sure. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Yeah, well, you know, just keep plugging. You know, that's really the thing, right? I'm a very process-oriented person. And as a lawyer, particularly as a defense lawyer in the criminal world, you have to really believe in the process. Commit to the process and not think about the outcome. If you're outcome oriented, it's sort of, it can be very you know, it can be very depressing in a way. But, you know, I just try to keep with the process, do the best you can, step by step. And then, you know, if you commit the best you can, then, you know, good things are much more likely to happen than if you just sort of, throw your hands up in the air and say, oh, it's an impossible dream. It's not going to happen for me. And, commit to learning the craft better. And every book, I mean, I look back at the first book now and I'm like, oh, I wish I changed that. Or, your craft gets better. It's a process.
Yep, for sure. Excellent advice, excellent insights, Mandy. Thank you so much. As we wrap up, we always like to give our guests a chance to recommend a book or a writer. You've already recommended a whole handful. Our listeners should be scurrying to chase down a lot of your recommendations already, but how about one more?
Okay, more of my favorite children. I kind of went down the Paul Bowles hole recently. I'm a big Paul Bowles fan.
Yes,
and I
indeed.
did a piece based on an artwork I did this contest, which was to write a piece about a picture in our museum. I chose something that was about Morocco. It took me back to Bowles and the sheltering sky, and then the rabbit hole opened and in I went. So anything Paul Bowles, but particularly Sheltering Sky, Spider's House, and then related to Bowles, something I've read recently and reread. I don't know if you've ever read any Lawrence Osborne. He writes a lot of different kinds of books, but he writes a lot about international places. And he has a book that is very nouveau Sheltering Sky called The Forgiven. And that is really great. It's about Morocco also, and it's very Bowlesian. It's spare. You're never really quite sure what's going on. So anything Lawrence Osborne or anything Bowles. And then just one last thing, I read Adrienne Brodeur's memoir, Wild Game, and she has a new book out, which I haven't read, which is fiction called Beautiful Animals, I think, or something animals. But that Wild Game was a really eye-opening memoir. Usually you're like, they're the misery moirs, drugs, alcohol, bad family, blah, blah, blah. But this one, the sort of hook in this is something you will not believe. And it's so well written and really lovely.
Wow. Well, that's all great. And back to Lawrence Osborne, he's actually got some kind of mystery noir things too. And one I remember was set in Africa, I believe, or maybe it was Mexico. It was Mexico. And now that I'm thinking about it, but it had a really good taut kind of Raymond Chandler feeling to it. And I'll look up the title and send it to you. Yeah.
They're not long.
No,
they're short.
No.
They're pretty short books. He has one called Beautiful Animals. That's why I'm confusing it with the new Brodeur book. And I think that one's about Thailand. And there's one about Vietnam. And they're all, he lives overseas somewhere. Yeah. And he also has an incredible book about traveling called The Art of Travel, which is nonfiction. So he seems to be a kind of peripatetic fellow. So I really, but his writing is compelling, but it's also just beautiful.
Wow, Mandy. Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today. Good luck with everything you've got going. And maybe we'll see you in San Diego, hopefully at BoucherCon.
Oh yeah, hopefully in that big crush of people.
Yeah, I know.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Bye-bye.